Good, we're back. So let me contrast now, before the break, as I started, the self-image of those New Englanders and Southerners. Here is a picture done about the same time as the one you saw before of the Philadelphia merchant Mifflin. Colonel Bernard Eliot, and also, let me introduce a picture of his wife, Mrs. Eliot. Maybe I can put both of them even. Notice the differences. The emphasis now is on the clothes. The emphasis is on the jewelry. The pose that they strike is far different than that of Mr. and Mrs. Mifflin, a relaxed pose that suggests that they have little to do all day but sit around and have their portraits painted. The upper classes of the South did not emphasize their diligence in industry, but the fruits of their labor. Fruits of labor that allowed them to lead lives of luxury rather than emphasizing their ability to master nature and produce things with their own hands. The differences in character between New Englanders and Southerners became increasingly clear to visitors to America. In fact, by the 1830s and 1840s, the diligence and industry of New England had even taken on some darker tones. Visitors were amazed at how single-minded those Yankees had become in the pursuit of profit above everything else. British writers would come to America and speak of the, quote, anxious spirit of gain that had perverted the men of the northern states. Up there, they were mammon-seeking mortals. They rose early, and they ate their meals with the rapidity of wolves in order to get down to the day's business. One British traveler, Francis Trollope, wrote that all agree New Englanders present a spectacle of industry and prosperity that is a delight to behold. Yet, I never met a single individual in any part of the Union who did not paint these New Englanders as sly, grinding, selfish, and tricking. Now, at the same time that the entrepreneurial spirit of the North was taking on these tones, the refinement and manner in the South had also grown more pronounced. One Scottish visitor wrote that the poles could not be more diametrically opposed than a native of the states south of the Potomac and a New Englander. The latter is a man devoted to the pursuits of gain. He is envious of all those who have more than he does. The former, as the Southerner, is distinguished by high-mindedness, generosity, and hospitality. He cares for money only for the enjoyments that it can procure. However, sometimes the Southern spirit of generosity also turned into downright laziness. In every farmhouse that you see here, you see 8 or 10 lazy men or boys lounging idly on the veranda or piazza or in front of it, their legs thrown up higher than their hips, their hats on, doing nothing because the Negro slaves can do the work. Now, clearly there were dangers here for the South. Another visitor named James Buckingham wrote that Southerners were taught to live off the wealth of the plantation and to avoid trade. Few of the men of the South, he warned, entered into any kind of business by which their fortunes could be improved. Habits of indolence, recklessness, and extravagance result from this. In fact, the most famous visitor to America in the 19th century, the Frenchman Alexis de Tocqueville, stated bluntly that Southerners loved greatness, luxury, renown, excitement, enjoyment, and above all else, idleness. The assessments of the characters of the two regions were really something new. Because if you'd gone to America in the 17th century, you would have found a New England that was much more notable for its religious habits than for its business mind. And in fact, you'd had to pick a region that was likely to prosper in the industrial era, it would not have been New England. Just consider some of the other choices and options. The South itself, Caribbean, Brazil, Mexico, these were all regions that were long used to growing crops for profit, for transporting them to markets around the world. Commercialization was nothing new to them. And one might have supposed that these other regions of the Americas, with their long experience at commercial agriculture, their long integration into the world market, their supplies of capital, their right from the start profit-making orientation, that this would have been the breeding ground for the entrepreneurs of the Industrial Revolution in the Americas. Why not, after all, just build textile mills right next to the cotton crop of Virginia or South Carolina? It seemed to make perfect sense. What about the sugar regions of the Caribbean? Sugar plantations there, they were already quasi-factories. In fact, you could argue that the most industrialized production of the world was taking place in the sugar plantations of the Caribbean. Plantations involved substantial capitalization, not just in land and slaves, but also in mills to grind cane, boiling houses to reduce and clean the juice, curing houses to make crystalline sugar and molasses, distilleries to make rum, storehouses to hold it all. So if commercialization paved the way for industrialization, well, that doesn't explain why industrialization should have come to the frozen north of the Americas before the balmy south of the continent. One thing that we have to explain is why some people might rush to embrace industrialization and why others, even though they might be oriented to the market, to profit, might avoid industrialization, or at least not embrace it as readily. The things that industrialization spelled, factories and wage labor and cities, permanent working class, these were controversial developments in the 19th century. The agrarian philosopher from Virginia, a man named John Taylor of Caroline, wrote that he believed only in the British climate, could the human animal bear, without extirpation, the corrupted air, the noisome exhalations, the incessant labor of those accursed manufactories. As late as 1816, a United States congressman wrote that all manufactories were conducted with slaves because the occupation has a tendency to degrade and debase the human mind. Factories, he warned, would prove destructive to the liberties of this republic. And both these men probably would have agreed with the somewhat later assessment of the playwright George Bernard Shaw, who wrote that the cotton factory is an invention that only could have been made by a greedy dog. Now, what was it about manufacturing factories that inspired so much fear in Americans? Fear in Americans who had no trouble at all accepting the commercialization of agriculture, Americans who could object seriously, apparently, that wage labor was enslavement when the entire economy of the South rested on real slavery. And what were the perils to the republic that these men spoke of? Well, in the early 19th century, two of the finest minds that American politics has ever produced engaged in a bitter, even acrimonious debate over this very issue. Debate centered squarely on the place of industry in American society. On one side stood Alexander Hamilton. Now, Hamilton had already perceived the revolutionary nature of industrialization. He wrote a famous report on manufacturers in which he stated that he believed the best hope of the new United States, at least in securing its economic position in the world, was to build up its manufacturing capability. He argued that America would not survive in a hostile and competitive world. It would not be able to position itself in international trade if it did not have the capability of making and manufacturing things. The key to economic development, he argued, lay in producing high-valued goods that you could exchange in the international economy, exchange with other nations. But America, Hamilton recognized, after independence from England was small. It was weak. It was undercapitalized. It didn't have ships and a powerful navy. It had no high-valued manufacturing goods that it could exchange for profit with the much wealthier and powerful nations like England and Holland. So unless the nation built up its manufacturing capability quickly, Hamilton went on, we were doomed to be hemmed in by the more powerful commercial nations, reduced to dependent status, mere raw material suppliers for others who would make the money manufacturing. Hamilton also stressed other things about manufacturing that he thought were really positive. It encouraged useful habits of mind. It encouraged and rewarded industry and diligence. It promoted innovation, technology. It rewarded capital for its investment. It helped to concentrate economic resources. And Hamilton believed that all of these factors boded well for America's future. We need a strong, healthy manufacturing and mercantile class in order to do battle in the commerce wars with England, wars that were now certain to result since America was a free nation. Hamilton's assessment, of course, was opposed by none other than Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson contradicted and disputed Hamilton on virtually every point. Jefferson disliked manufacturing for the very same reasons that Hamilton liked it. Diligence of work that Hamilton admired, Jefferson argued was nothing but drudgery and slave labor. The concentration of capital that Hamilton spoke favorably of, Jefferson regarded it with suspicion. He was afraid that the concentration of wealth and money among the industrial class would create a power elite in America. Most importantly, Jefferson denied that factories were the source of wealth and greatness for nations. Land was the source of wealth. Farmers were the strength of the nation, not industrialists or merchants, let alone financiers, bankers, or lawyers, all the things that seem to go with industrialization. The opposing views of Hamilton and Jefferson had sort of real moral force because they also reflected opposing political philosophies. Hamilton had little trouble imagining this sort of stratified society with a wealthy elite on top and a landless working class on the bottom. He had no trouble with this idea. He's a man who had grown up and come from Barbados, a slave society composed of a tiny, wealthy white elite and many poor landless slaves. Hamilton also pointed out that Jefferson and his kind had no right to complain about the slavery that industrialization bred, since their wealth depended on slaves, African slaves, and slave labor on the plantations. So you won't be surprised to learn that Alexander Hamilton was fervently committed to the abolition of slavery in America. Hamilton was a Federalist, and that meant he was suspicious of what he regarded as Jefferson's overly enthusiastic embrace of mob rule. After all, if the wealthy elite didn't run the country, who would? Dirt farmers? Country bumpkins? Ill-educated artisans? None of these people had much of a place in Hamilton's view of society. Who knew better the interests of America than a cosmopolitan mercantile elite located in the nation's biggest cities, its financial centers, oriented towards international trade? Now, Jefferson was hardly, by our standards at least, an anti-elitist, but he did have a much more generous view of who would run society. In his view, society would be run by men, not women, of course, but men who were freed from the corrupting influences of dependency. Workers, factory workers, didn't fit this model either. They were dependent. They owned no land. They did not own the means of production. They had no capital. They worked for others. And by Jefferson's definition, people who were not economically independent could not be politically independent either. So democracy depended on having a citizenry composed largely of people who were economically independent. And that meant especially farmers, yeoman farmers who owned their own land. Jefferson, of course, had problems with the slavery issue, and clearly slaves would not fit into Jefferson's political world either. But he dealt with the slavery issue, or I guess he rather ducked the slavery issue, by arguing in essence that African slaves would do the drudgery work that would free whites for much better sorts of pursuits. In other words, the free and independent citizenry that Jefferson valued so much would rest on the slavery of others. Now, only a nation that was already essentially committed to this sort of racist view of society, of humanity, could such a tactic have worked. And in the end, as we'll see in a few minutes, the slavery issue would come back to haunt the Jeffersonians. It would become, in fact, the great point of contention between those who promoted the industrial worldview and those who defended agrarianism. To encourage his ideal society, Thomas Jefferson did not look to cities, or to factories, or even to international trade. He looked west. He looked to all of that open land that lay just beyond the borders of what was then the United States. Land whose only claimants were Indians, Indians who could be pushed aside to make way for white farmers. You will not be surprised to learn that Thomas Jefferson was the president who, at one stroke, increased the size of the United States by more than any other president with the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. So a vast inland empire opened up during Thomas Jefferson's administration, land that needed farmers, farmers who Jefferson believed were the soul of a democratic nation. In the Jefferson view, morality, economy, and democratic politics all worked together. Jefferson even went so far as to argue that American farmers should dedicate themselves to growing certain crops which comported with democratic values. For example, they should grow wheat. Wheat, he argued, feeds laborers plentifully. It requires only moderate toil. It diffuses plenty and happiness throughout the land. Now, bear in mind that Thomas Jefferson was a native of Virginia, a place where they grew things like tobacco and cotton. But he argued that supercilious crops like tobacco or cotton or sugar were not the crops of a democratic society. These were the crops that, as he put it, worked labor hard in infinite wretchedness. That were his words, only suited for slave labor. Jeffersonians had very definite values, very definite ideas on how the country should be structured economically and what the political consequences of that were. But keep in mind, they were not anti-market or anti-commercial. Their view, the economy of the United States, depended on healthy and growing free markets. Free markets were good in the Jeffersonian view. It was Alexander Hamilton who was actually committed to direct government intervention into the economy. He believed that industry would not thrive in America without some form of government support, without some form of protection to survive, at least initially, in the competition with the far better established industries of England. Hamilton dismissed free trade ideas like those developed by Adam Smith about the same time as the American Revolution. Jeffersonians embraced the free trade ideology of Adam Smith. Of course, in the end, at least in the short run, the Jeffersonians won, if only because Alexander Hamilton was eliminated from the debate when he was killed in a duel with Aaron Burr. But in the short run, it really did seem like the Jeffersonian view of America was going to triumph. 1820, America was composed largely of farmers. The inland empire was expanding, being filled up with more farmers. Trade with the Atlantic had declined in importance. Hamilton had believed that the Atlantic trade was going to be the key to American growth. But that became much less important than trade within the United States itself. Free markets, open competition, agriculture, and democracy all seemed to be working hand in glove. Still, there were some problems with the Jeffersonian world, even in the 1830s and 1840s. There were some problems in this Jeffersonian paradise, in other words. For one thing, industry was growing up in the North, even though America had not embraced the sort of pro-industry policies that Alexander Hamilton had argued for. One of the great ironies, I think, of history and of the Jeffersonians is that it was Thomas Jefferson's 1807 embargo against British manufacturing imports, followed then by the War of 1812, that had shielded the American textile industry from competition with England at a crucial moment in its development. So Thomas Jefferson had unwittingly and involuntarily given government support to American industrialization. In other ways as well, the pure Jeffersonian view of America was not quite working out as Thomas Jefferson had hoped that it would. Jefferson had argued that it was dangerous to create a coalition of bankers and merchants and industrialists who would become, as he thought, a kind of corrupting aristocracy that would undermine American commitments to individualism, freedom, democracy. But oddly enough, it wasn't the industrialists who were anti-individual. The industrialists seemed to be becoming more and more committed to individual freedom. In fact, some said too committed to individual freedom. They were advocates of the freedom of all men and women to work for wages and to be paid wages for what they did. Now, conservatives in America contended that this sort of freedom was a sham. It was the freedom to starve. It was the freedom to work for another in a harsh marketplace over which you had no control. And America, they said, did not need more freedom or individualism. What America really needed was a core of traditional values that would shield and protect people from the harsh marketplace. Except that the men who articulated this sort of anti-market view were, in fact, the largest slaveholders of the South. It was the pro-slavery argument that became the counterpoint to the growing free labor argument of the North. Now, defenders of slavery had many different positions from which to defend the institution. Some were religious, others were legal, and others were racist, others were political. But their most powerful arguments in defense of slavery usually came back to economics. And I don't mean just the economics of self-interest, an economic vision of society and how it was supposed to work. Many historians have noted that Southerners were remarkable. The Southern economy was remarkable for its lack of industry at the very time that the North was industrializing rapidly. There were few cities in the South. There were few railroads in the South. There were few opportunities for the sort of non-farm spin-off activities which were driving the economy of the North. The South was following what could be called a classic extractive economy pattern the very time the North was industrializing. That's to say, it was pulling resources from nature, processing them, and then selling them to someone else who did the higher value functions of manufacturing or financing or shipping or those sorts of things. This extractive economy of the South was carried on extensively. That's to say, soil was used, exhausted, resources depleted, and then production was moved elsewhere onto new lands, more fertile soils, and the cycle was repeated over again. In the short term, it was a system that produced handsome profits, at least for those who owned the land and owned the slaves. But in the long term, it left the region economically dependent, ecologically damaged, and unable to compete with the advancing industrial economy of the North. Well, the question is why? Why did the North and the South take these distinctive patterns? What was responsible for the Southern commitment to an economy that seemed both to diverge increasingly from other parts of the United States and also, in the long run, produced so many unhappy consequences? Now, historians have argued this point over and over again, and they've generally produced two sets of answers. One goes like this. The answer is simple. The South had little choice but to follow the road that it followed. Cotton was profitable. Cotton production offered higher profits than any other thing the South might do, any other crop like wheat or corn or livestock. Moreover, the South was specialized in cotton production, whereas the North had become specialized in industry. And specialization makes sense. It didn't make any sense for Southerners to try and replicate what the North had already done, try and compete with those Yankee manufacturers. Moreover, finally, for all of its moral horrors, slavery was efficient. That is to say, it produced profits for people, and when people are making profits, they generally don't have much incentive to change, at least not without a fight. The alternative explanation, and in my opinion, the better explanation, goes like this. It takes almost the opposite tact as the one I've just given you. First, it notes that despite specialization, the fact is that there were plenty of opportunities, economic opportunities, that had gone unmet in the South. The list actually is quite long. It includes things like the production of iron and tin and copper, the milling of lumber, the fabrication of stoves and wagons and carriages, the spinning of cotton into thread, the weaving of thread into fabric, the tanning of leather, the printing of books, not to mention the whole service sector of wholesaling and retailing and insurance and financing. In all of these areas, the Southern economy had opportunities for profit that, for one reason or another, were not taken advantage of. Or in the words of one historian of the South, the region suffered from a deplorable scarcity of capital and entrepreneurship ready to take advantage of opportunities that lay right at its feet. What could have been responsible for this failure? Of course, you might be content simply to look at the character and the values of those Yankees on the one hand and Southerners on the other, and rest with the answer that Yankees had the aggressive spirit of entrepreneurship, the Protestant spirit of profit-making, and that meant they were simply more innovative, more profit-seeking, more risk-taking than their Southern cousins. Maybe so. Apparently, there's something about plantations or slavery that either stifles industrialization or undermines the entrepreneurial spirit. Richard Henry Lee, who was a member of a wealthy Virginia planter class, he concurred with this assessment. As early as 1760, he noted that, quote, some of our neighboring colonies, though much later than us in point of settlement, are now far ahead of us in improvement. What was the reason for this? Well, Lee concluded that, quote, with their whites, they import arts and agriculture, whilst with our blacks we exclude both. By 1857, the concern that slavery was somehow undermining the Southern economy had reached extreme proportions. Now, in his masterpiece called The Impending Crisis of the South and How to Meet It, an acerbic critic of the Southern economy named Hinton Rowland Helper wrote this: less than 3/4 of a century ago, the South, with all the advantages of soil, climate, rivers and harbors, minerals and forests, began an even race, even economic race, an even race with the North. But now, in the space of 70 years, we find her completely distanced, enervated, dejected, dishonored. And what was the cause of all this? Well, Helper, who was a native of North Carolina, knew exactly who the culprit was. As he wrote, slave drivers are the sole authors of her disgrace, and as they have sown, so let them reap. The idea that the South had an anti-industrial culture has deep roots in the ideas that surround the slave South. Those roots were, as Helper put it, directly related to the way in which slavery worked. In fact, they seem to have been so deep that even after the Civil War, the end of slavery, they continued to choke off enterprise in the South for decades to come. Now, all slave societies of the New World seem to have suffered from the same economic problems. In general, those societies that depended on the control of labor by a small group of elite landowners were likely to develop a powerful set of interests among the most powerful members of society that worked against diversification, industrialization, and rapid economic growth. In the 1830s and the 1840s, the pro-slavery defenders, the Southerners who defended the institution of slavery, actually began making an explicit argument against industrialization. They were cognizant of the differences between the North and the South, and they argued that not only was the South less industrialized, but it should remain that way. It was better that things were that way. Slavery, they contended, was a much more benign institution than factory labor. After all, at least the slaveholder had an interest in the long-term welfare of his slaves, whereas the factory owner could care less what happened to his workers once the evening whistle blew. If they starved or if they died from overwork, that wasn't his problem. There were always more workers at the factory gate the next day. As a way of life, the pro-slavery defenders went on. The plantation system had other advantages. It preserved traditional values, that's to say, the values of community and family, values which were uprooted by this increasingly profit-oriented market world. Slaveholders even maintained the fiction that they lost money on slavery, that slaves did little productive work, that many times they kept slaves on the plantation out of the kindness of their own hearts. Slaveholding, they said, is not about making money. It's about status and the preservation of a way of life. And Africans who didn't live in slavery would die out in the harsh market competition of life. Well, you don't have to believe these self-justifications to see that the defenders of slavery had focused on a very sore point, a point that even northern industrialists were concerned about: the social costs of industry, the fear that floated in the minds of those Yankee industrialists that we were going to create a world filled with dark, satanic mills, a world like the experiences that Charles Dickens was already exposing in industrialized England. However, in contrast to what the defenders of slavery said and how they like to portray their society and their institution, the truth is actually a bit more complicated and in many ways even more morally repugnant than that. Because slavery was fundamentally a commercial enterprise. In fact, it was often one that could be more brutal in its pursuit of profit than even the most dedicated Yankee industrialist could manage in his textile mills. The fact is that the Jeffersonians, who professed to believe in democracy and individualism and freedom, to have feared the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of those greedy, profit-seeking Yankees, they managed to create in the Southern slaveholder class one of the most greedy, avaricious, and power-hungry elites that the world has ever seen. The goal of slave owners was money. The means that they pursued it was commercial. And the treatment of labor that resulted was relentlessly exploitative. Remember, slavery expanded steadily in America. Expanded right from colonial times to the Civil War. It expanded despite the closing of the slave trade with Africa. It expanded despite efforts to limit and contain it through things like the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. It expanded despite abolitionists, both white and black, despite the Underground Railroad, John Brown, slave revolts, and legal challenges such as that launched by African Americans like Dred Scott. It expanded despite the fact that everyone could see that slavery was destroying the American political system and that it was leading the nation toward civil war. And slavery expanded for one simple reason. It expanded because it was profitable. New fertile lands opened up in the West, and slaveholders took every advantage of it, either by moving men and women and families to those lands themselves by sending their children ahead with part of their slaves, or by selling their slaves in the slave market of New Orleans. When the rich, dark, fertile soils of places like Alabama, the Mississippi Delta, and East Texas opened up, that meant high profits in cotton growing. And high profits meant high prices for slaves. The value of slaves roughly quadrupled between 1815 and 1860. So on the eve of the Civil War, the South was literally more invested in slavery than it ever had been at any other time in its history. The South's wealth depended almost completely on its ability to exploit slave labor. Now, the relentlessly commercial aspects of slavery are probably best revealed in the way in which slavery used and often used up people in the process of growing cotton. The output of slaves in the agricultural South was roughly equal to the output of northern free farmers in the decades before the Civil War. In fact, at first glance, it looks like the two systems of production are roughly similar, slave or free. They seem to produce about the same amount, same level of productivity. That was sort of a paradox for people living at the time, and also to some extent for people today. How could slaves be as productive as free labor? It didn't make sense. I mean, one would expect that a slave would do everything possible to not work as hard, to frustrate the economic system that exploited him, to certainly not put in the same level of effort as a free laborer. In fact, anti-slavery proponents had often rested their case just on this point. Slave labor was degraded labor, debased labor. No man who was a slave would ever be as productive or industrious as a man who got to keep what he earned. 19th century Americans living in the North, this was a very, very touchy issue. It was an extremely important point to them that slave labor not be as productive as free labor. Ideas about the democracy of the common people, ideas about individual freedom depended on believing that freedom was not just morally right, it was economically superior to slavery. Well, it turns out that proponents of free labor did not have to worry that slavery contradicted their beliefs, because the reason that slave labor was as productive as free labor was because slaves worked harder. They worked longer. They worked longer days, they worked more days, and they worked more of their lives than did free workers. They worked under extremely unpleasant conditions. They did work that few people would do if they had a choice, or voluntarily accept, even at high wages. Plantations relied on gang labor, strictly overseen by slave drivers and overseers. Whips were ever present, and public whippings could occur as often as once a month. The cost of supervision of labor on plantations was much higher than it was on free family farms in the North. And that's in large part to assure that slaves would work, to look out for sabotaging of tools or equipment, or even of the cotton crop itself. This was a common means of subversion and quiet rebellion among the slaves. In fact, far from accepting their condition, African Americans living in slavery seem to have done everything possible to undermine slavery as a system of production. That meant that slave owners had to rely on constant attention, to use coercion, to use force, to assure that slavery maintained its profitability. In other words, there were no plantations of easy lives and kind masters. These were ruthless people. They were profit-making ventures, and owners would stop at literally nothing, including violence and murder, to make sure that slavery paid. Now, two statistics give us a sense of the cost of the system to those that exploited. Consider this: between 1800 and 1860, free workers in the United States reduced the amount of time they worked by about 25%. Now, it's a cliche, of course, that farmers work from sun up to sundown, but apparently improvements in technology and in productivity allowed a little bit of a relaxation of this seemingly biblical injunction. The fact is that farmers began to work less and have more free time left over for other things. Even in northern factories, for all the talk about the incessant toil of the factory, the fact is that the daily grind was cut down from about 13 hours a day to, on average, 10 hours a day between 1800 and 1860. In fact, in our own sort of time-stressed lives, we should take note of these developments because there has been no comparable reduction in hours worked in the 20th century. We today work about as long as our grandparents did. College professors' experiences, of course, don't count. Now, northern factory workers and northern farmers were enjoying something of a reduction in the hours and a respite from the ceaseless toil. The slave work day, however, did not change at all. Besides the plowing, the planting, the weeding, the hoeing, and the harvesting of the cotton crop, slaves were also responsible for growing a substantial portion of their own food. And at times of peak labor demand, that is during the planting and harvesting seasons that occurred every 6 months, the demand for labor on plantations could be back-breaking. The costs of slavery are probably best reflected in one of the grimmest statistics that that institution produced, the high rate of child mortality on American slave plantations. The mortality rate of children born into slavery was similar to that of famine-stricken, war-torn, and plague-infested areas in the world today. Enslaved children who were able to survive the rigors of the early years suffered still more. Now, one of the best measures that we have of people's well-being that goes back 200 years or so is height. Height is a very good indicator of health and of diet. Comparisons of height of people across populations often have much to do with nutrition, with how much food they get, and also with how many calories they consume. Differences in height across populations often reflect differences in calories. I don't mean just the calories that they take into their bodies, but also how many calories they expend in the course of working. Those who live in calorie deficit, that is to say, those who either don't get enough to eat, don't get enough of the right combinations of vitamins and calories, or who work so hard that they use up a good portion of the calories that they consume in their diets, they will tend to grow up to be, on average, shorter than our better-fed people. Well, what does it mean to say that the children of slaves were substantially shorter than those who were born to free parents, wherever you looked and no matter what the conditions? Now, one reason you might suspect is that slave children were short because slave adults were short because nobody on the plantation got enough to eat. But interestingly enough, comparing the heights of adults free and adults slave shows very little difference in height. And even the children of overworked, underfed, underpaid factory workers were on average higher than the children of slaves. So why was slavery so brutal on children? Well, remember, the chief advantage of slavery to the slave owner was its ability to siphon off the surplus of production that slaves created over and above what it took to maintain them. In other words, slavery was an institution that gave slave owners incentive to behave like slave drivers. This was particularly true during the times of peak labor demand, that is, during the planting and harvesting season. That's when labor demand was at its greatest on the plantation. Those peak times occurred twice a year. Now, a healthy adult, healthy woman, might be able to withstand the rigors of overwork. But that sort of labor consumed calories that few of them had to spare. Pregnant women, of course, need all the calories that they can get, as do nursing women, breastfeeding women, and invariably, slave women who were pregnant during the 9 months of pregnancy ran up against one of those times of peak labor demand, times of hard, health-sapping, calorie-draining work. They worked right up until the moment that they gave birth, and then pretty soon they were back working in the fields again. The result, a high percentage of low birth weight babies, a high percentage of sick babies, and a high percentage of babies who did not live more than a few days. Then, if the child survived this initial insult, there were still other dangers, because women worked in the fields right beside men. That left no time for breastfeeding. In the 19th century, mother's milk was not just best for babies, it was dangerous, indeed extremely risky, to even contemplate feeding children anything but. There were no scientifically specified formulas. There were no sterile conditions to produce substitute formulas. There was no clean water to mix formulas with. The result, homemade substitutes consisting of cow's milk, thin porridges, pablum, which were wholly inadequate for the nutritional needs of children. Invariably, again, slave women ran up against one of those peak labor demand times just when they were nursing, just when their children were young and most vulnerable to infectious diseases. Children of even mothers who were dedicated to their health and well-being, there was no choice but to abandon them and substitute inadequate forms of nutrition for breastfeeding, thereby endangering both the life and also the health of the child. So what this tells us, Southern economy diverged in fundamental ways, not just in what it produced, but in fundamental ways as to how it operated, how it used capital, technology, and most of all, how it used labor. It was a much different sort of social order than the ones the industrialists of the North had created. The South remained committed to labor-intensive methods of production. It relied on its ability to exploit workers and get away with it, basically. That meant, however, that it had less need for the sort of capital-intensive methods, the sort of new technological innovations, the labor-saving technology that was characteristic of the North and of industrialization. Technologies were increasing the North's productivity, spinning off all sorts of profitable new opportunities and ventures. For example, like Southerners, Northern farmers faced the problem of labor, getting enough people to work, especially during the peak times, during planting and harvesting season. The fertile frontier had lots of good land, but frequently not enough labor to take advantage of it. Population densities on the frontier were low. And while eventually the land filled up with farmers and their families, most people who went west were seeking to become independent farmers, not to work for others. Those who had no money for land, of course, had to take whatever work that they could get, but their hope was to save enough in order to acquire their own farm. So even if farmers could find people willing to work, the wages they had to pay were often high, and they couldn't always get labor when they needed it. During those times of peak labor demand, at harvesting and planting season, it would be extremely difficult to find enough people or to find them at wages that the farmer could afford to pay. In other words, given a choice that freedom allowed, men would not work as slaves were forced to work. Women would not put their families and children in jeopardy in order even to acquire the high wages that the work might offer. In the North, during these times of peak labor demand, during the harvesting and planting season, demand would outstrip supply. It became extremely difficult for northern farmers to hire enough labor. The solution to the farm labor problem in the North was the typical American answer: technology, mechanization. Mechanization in northern farms replaced more and more hand labor, which was hard to find and hard to come by. In 1834, a man named Cyrus McCormick invented a machine that dramatically cut the harvesting time, a reaping machine. And over the next 50 years or so, mechanical reapers, threshers, and pickers diffused all throughout the farm belt of the North. That meant higher productivity, more leisure time for farmers. It meant as well a thriving agricultural implements industry located in places like Chicago and Milwaukee and Minneapolis. It meant the demand for raw materials like iron and steel to build those agricultural tools and machines. It meant a need for engineers, for mechanics, for skilled factory labor. The industrial spin-offs of the North were reflected in things like patent statistics. Between the American Revolution and the Civil War, the number of patents issued in the United States skyrocketed, but the vast majority of them were issued to places like New England and the North, the sites of industrial production and the mechanization of farming. It also appears that during the early years of industrialization, knowledge and skill were at least as important as machines, as a prime tool of economic growth and increasing productivity. That's to say, factories themselves involved less the radical development of new machines and new technologies, and more the increasing skill at using machines effectively. It's sort of like the computer revolution today. It matters less that people have computers on their desk. It matters more that they learn how to use them to work smarter and more efficiently. Well, increasing need for technical skill and knowledge in the North was reflected in things like the North's dedication to education, to worker training. In 1850, only about 3% of the population of the North was illiterate. In the South, the figure was 43%. Now, it's true that a lot of that reflects the fact that about 90 to 95% of the slave population was illiterate. But even among white Southerners, the illiteracy rate was about 8 times that of the North. Slaves were not taught to read or write because of the fear that literacy would increase their power and resistance. So in order to control labor, in order to subordinate the black population, in order, in other words, to keep slavery doing what it did, slave owners harmed their ability to acquire technical and scientific skills and knowledge that would have increased the level of industrialization and diversification of the Southern economy. In other words, while the North was investing in machines, capital, skills, knowledge, technique, Southerners were literally investing in men and women and the techniques of controlling, driving, and exploiting their labor. Northern farmers needed a Cyrus McCormick because they had no other way of dealing with the labor shortage. Slave families had no choice. When labor was needed to exploit the fertile soils of the Mississippi Delta or East Texas, it could be moved there against its will. In essence, slavery in the South solved an economic dilemma that in the North induced innovation, learning, and new technology. And that finally brings us to the whole nub of the issue of economic development. If Southerners were so cagey in how they used and exploited labor in agriculture, one might ask, well, why not do the same thing for industry? Why not industrial slavery? Why not beat the Yankees at their own game? In fact, there were industrial slaves in the South. In Virginia, slaves worked in coal mines and at iron forges. One of the largest industrial enterprises in the South, the Tredegar Iron Works in Virginia, used slave labor. In South Carolina, as far back as the 1830s, some planters had tried to open factories using slaves. But industrial slavery had its limits, and they're very revealing limits about the differences between the world that the South was creating and the world the North was creating. Apparently, no slave society in the New World, no slave society in the Americas, was able to overcome the problems and limitations of using slave labor in industry. Industrial slavery required things like the concentration of African Americans in cities and at the sites of the factories. It required training and education and literacy in order to let workers operate the machines effectively. These were dangerous developments as far as slaveholders were concerned. For example, concentration of slaves in cities increased the opportunities for escaping, for planning insurrections, for communicating dangerous and subversive anti-slavery ideas. Illiteracy and isolation on the widely spaced plantations had been part of the methods of controlling slaves, methods that industrialization would have threatened or undermined. Industry also seemed to require a new set of incentives. There was great potential for sabotage from disgruntled workers, workers who now had access to expensive machines. Shirking work or slowing down, that would be extremely expensive in an expensive environment like the factory with its expensive machines. The most successful example of industrial slavery in the South, the Tredegar Iron Works in Virginia, paid slaves wages. It was already a half step out of slavery. In fact, some Southerners feared that it was even more than that. One of the fiery defenders of slavery, a South Carolinian named James Henry Hammond, wrote that whenever a slave is made a mechanic, and mechanic was sort of the generic 19th century word for someone who worked in industry. Whenever a slave is made a mechanic, he is more than half freed and soon becomes, as all history attests, the most corrupt and turbulent of his class. Turbulent indeed. Already, urban slaves were noted for their independence of mind and their uppity behavior. One group of slaveholders said that the evil lies, not the evil of urban slavery and industrial slavery, the evil lies in breaking down the relationship between master and slave and the assumption of freedom and independence on the part of the slave. Abraham Lincoln would write that a nation could not exist as a house divided, half slave and half free. Well, Southerners feared that industrialization would create men who were half slave and half free, and they knew that this condition could not last either. Freedom threatened to triumph over slavery whenever slaves became industrial workers. The limits of industrial slavery, I think, now make clear just how slavery and the system, social and economic system of the South really operated. Slavery was not just another method for use in labor to produce things. It was also a distinctive social system. It had a brutal logic all of its own. Slaves produced profits for owners because slaves could be made to work harder, longer, and in ways that free labor never would work. By extracting profits from slaves, that required power, that required control, sort of control that industrialists didn't have over their labor, or at least a different sort of control. That depended on things, the slaveholders' control of slaves depended on things like poverty, illiteracy, isolation, the destruction of families, not to mention brutality and violence. Industrial slavery would have undermined the system of power. It would have made slaves more like free workers in the North. It's true that wages, skills, knowledge, and education by themselves did not directly provide freedom, but all would have wreaked havoc with the dominance of the master class. And in that sense, in that very deep sense, industry and slavery were incompatible. Comparative studies of economic development in different regions have argued that places that are free from traditional authority, from elite control, from overarching governments, those are places that generally can promote rapid economic growth. So in contrast to Latin America, where the control of land in the hands of a powerful landowning class remained at the core of the economy, landholding in America was much more widely dispersed, especially in the North among small-scale family farms. These were at the heart of the commercial economy of the 19th century. Most decisions about what to produce, how to produce it, how to respond to market conditions were made by individuals. In general, it seems that these sorts of patterns promoted more rapid growth than did the concentration of resources in the hands of a small elite, the concentration of land on large estates and landholdings. Places where tradition, culture, and status remained firmly fixed, where control and ownership of land and labor remained in the hands of a small group of people, those were places that seemed to grow slower historically. And by the 19th century, the South had become just one of those places, one of those slow-growing traditional agrarian societies. It had a wealthy, powerful, landowning elite. It used unfree labor. It had traditional values that disparaged business, commerce, and above all, industry. It defended itself with appeals to a traditional way of life, pre-industrial values against rapid change and modernization. And it was willing to sacrifice gain and profits in the interest of maintaining a way of life, even to the point of going to war. So the South was a perfect demonstration that profits, capitalism, and economic growth, these are three very separate things. One does not always imply the other. Southern planters certainly sought profit, and they had the means, by exploiting slave labor, to get profit. But they were not willing to go another step. They were not willing to pursue profit at any cost. In other words, their capital was invested in human beings. They were not willing to risk destroying the system that gave them control of people in order to take advantage of profitable opportunities such as those that might have existed in industry. They were not willing to put capital at risk in those cases. Rather, it was protection of their position, their existing wealth, the wealth that was created by the system of slavery, that mattered most. And that bred a distinctly conservative attitude when it came to the economy, especially to radical innovations like industrialization. Certainly, slavery harmed African Americans. There's no doubt about that. It harmed as well free blacks who had to live in a society predicated on racism. But slavery also harmed free whites. It harmed all of the society of the South by inculcating a cautious, traditional, and conservative approach to economic opportunities. Now, when you look at it that way, when you compare the South and the North, the transformation of New England is all the more remarkable. Consider what it involved. It involved the opening of the West, the creation of a transportation network that linked the East and the West, the reorientation of the countryside away from self-sufficiency towards commercial opportunity, the dramatic pilfering of the knowledge of how to make the machines that spun textiles, the creation of a whole new class of mechanics, skilled laborers, people who are experts in machine technology, the creation of a whole new labor force, employment of women, and then immigrants in the factories, whole reorientation of the landscape and the ecology of the region, the building of towns and cities, of canals and railroads, the damming of streams, the alteration of New England away from agriculture, away from nature, and towards the factory. The payoffs to those changes were enormous. I don't mean just the payoffs to the individuals who built the textile mills, although of course they grew extremely wealthy. But I mean the payoff in the form of rapid economic growth for the region, growth that continued to accelerate all throughout the 19th century. When you look at it in the context of slavery, the northern path of industrialization stands out all the more because, after all, slavery was common in the Americas, in the New World. The use of unfree labor, whether it was peasants tied to haciendas, whether it was other landed estates that were at the center of economies that ranged from Mexico to Eastern Europe to Russia to China. Ownership of land and control of people, those were the preferred routes to wealth and power all throughout the world. In 1750, it was the idea of free labor that was the radical, revolutionary idea. The idea that wealth would flow from small farms oriented to the market, from an ever-expanding web of connections that linked agriculture, commerce, industry, and technology. These were revolutionary ideas. These were ideas that most people in the Americas were not prepared to accept. In America itself, in North America, in the United States, eventually, it would take a civil war in order to defeat slavery and to convince those who disparaged industry which economic path offered the most opportunities for generating wealth. There? Sure.
You said earlier that places where power and money control, where the money and the land was controlled by a small group of people, it grew more slowly than places that this wealth was distributed among more people. What do you mean by grow?
I mean grow economically in terms of national income, GNP, those sorts of measures.
Okay, thank you.
It doesn't, in other words, it does not say anything about the distribution of the fruits of growth, which is a complicated issue as well. But certainly in terms, if you want a sort of growing region, economy, or nation, my argument would be that places that relied less on the coerced labor of unfree people and the concentration of resources, land, in the hands of elite, that those places grew faster. So.
We're going to use the last few minutes of our class to raise some, I think, provocative questions. And I thought the way I might introduce this was by using a top 10 list modeled after David Letterman's. I'll only use the top 3. And the question would be how to provoke a fight in a bar room. Number 3, belittle a man's masculinity. Number 2, raise the following topic of conversation: Christianity, Judaism, or Islam, which is the one true faith. Or 3, claim that the reason that certain regions industrialize and other regions do not is because of the superiority of one region's culture. So what I thought I might do first to provoke debate between Ken and Ketziel is to ask each of them to comment on the other's presentation and what struck them about the issues it raises for development and underdevelopment. Which one would prefer to go first? I don't mean to, I'm going to put them on the spot, but I'm not going to put them completely on the spot.
You're our guest lecturer.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Well, I thought that what Ketziel was getting at actually comported very well with my presentation. That is that there are sort of fundamental differences between the way in which societies orient themselves to the market, to capital, and to labor, and that the sort of encomienda, hacienda sorts of systems really fit with my model of the unfree labor, concentration of resources, and a more traditional hierarchical authority, which I would argue worked against the sorts of patterns that led to diversification and the development of all those linkages that made New England wealthy. So I saw it as fitting quite well with my model.
Okay. I think there was a lot of overlap, and I mean, in the sense that I think we were both looking at cultural factors, and maybe we should throw the ball back at him and ask him where is the implicit cultural superiority coming in? Where's that argument coming in? One thing that strikes me with regard to the importance of culture in this transformation, in these transformations of development, is something that you said with regard to efficiency. At one point, you said that I don't know now the specific issue of making the work more efficient in order to produce capital, or to make the worker more efficient, and the technical industrialization of the tools to make it.
Right.
And I think one thing, the issue of the cultural importance of development, is this idea of efficiency. There was a notion of efficiency that was, we have a common notion of efficiency, but it's measured specifically here from a very particular perspective of those, as you continually pointed out, of the bourgeois, the capitalists,
Right.
who were, and
Right.
one person called only a dog. What was
Only a greedy dog.
Only a greedy
could come up
dog.
with the textile.
Only the greedy dog could come up with a textile. Only the greedy dog had this value of efficiency, this specific efficiency, which was totally negative against other kinds of values.
Except, it seems to me, that Southerners, say, or plantation owners, or slaveholders, although they often defended themselves by appealing to non-market values, pre-modern values, were equally ruthless in the way that they would exploit their economic system using slave labor. So I would agree that efficiency can have many different definitions. Well, more than that, though. I mean, they really had a fundamentally different set of interests and a different view of what wealth meant, what prosperity meant, and even to some extent what efficiency meant. I mean, that efficiency to them was tied to the ability to more effectively exploit a group of slaves, but maintaining their power to sort of control the whole system. So they weren't going to allow industrialization to interfere with that. They were not going to educate slaves. They were not going to let them live in cities. They were not going to pay them wages, and as one person said, more than a half step towards freedom in doing so. So they were fundamentally different cultures, but they were grounded, as I see it, in equally profit-oriented, equally exploitative views.
Okay, let me follow up with then another question. One of the most striking points, I think, that both presentations offered was the unpredictability of history. That is, in 1650, there would have been no doubt in our minds which was the wealthiest part of the Americas and which had greater prospects for the future. And so in 1663, it would make perfect sense to trade New York for Suriname. What do you make of this, about the fact that people would have so misjudged the situation then and found it so difficult to imagine what the future would bring?
Well, I think that's a very good point. I would agree 100% that no one would have thought, maybe not New York, but maybe Boston for Suriname. New York for Barbados. I don't know. But yeah, I think that is exactly right. I mean, no one foresaw where industrialization was going to lead. I mean, Alexander Hamilton understood that industrialization was, at least he believed, was preferable or was necessary. But even he didn't understand how America was going to develop. He was oriented towards the Atlantic. He was oriented towards the world of the Atlantic economy and the exchange of commodities like sugar, whereas in fact America's future lay westward, as I see it. It lay in the sort of commercialization of agriculture in the West, and then the freeing of places like New England to develop industry, and also, as I mentioned, that agriculture in America also fed into industry in places like the North, where you needed to develop mechanization and agricultural implements. So all of that, I think, was completely unpredictable. It doesn't say much, I think, for people who believe that they can plan a road of development for underdeveloped countries. I think it suggests it's highly problematic.
One of the most striking differences among the Americas, when you take a simple look at a map, has to do with the number and size of cities. In the United States, as early as 1860, the United States had more large cities than any other country in the world. Now, by our standards, they were tiny. Only one city had as many as 1 million people. But something like 25 cities were already over 100,000. And that's very unusual in the world. If you look around the Americas, one thing that's quite striking is that in many societies there's one very large metropolitan center, but there aren't a lot of them. In Texas, I mean, there are now, I believe, 4 cities in the top 10 of the United States population. Quite striking. What difference do you think it makes that from a very early date there was such a difference in urban formations?
I think that could be very important. In fact, can I show your other?
Yes.
Yes, Steve has produced, I think, this very revealing. Now, this is what year?
1950.
1950. All right, this is a map of the railroads of the United States, and it's a bit later than the period I was talking about, but I think it illustrates, you notice the incredibly intensive transportation network, and of course Chicago and the cities of upstate New York, all located along this transportation network of the industrialized sectors of the United States. Needless to say, industrialization has moved elsewhere since that time. Now, if you look at a map of railroads in South America, you notice that not only is there less development, which reflects the fact there are fewer urban places to connect by railroads, but even those that exist tend to go sort of in one direction. That's to say, from the interior, where the agricultural products are produced, to the coast, where they're shipped off elsewhere for people to process into manufactured goods. And this is the classic extractive pattern of development. And if you looked at a map of the South in 1850, railroad map of the South, it would have looked exactly the same. There would have been a small network of lines that connected the cotton-growing plantations with the ports on the coast, like Charleston. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right.
Let me use the last 30 seconds to make what I hope will pull our talk together. In 1660, in England, they hired a philosopher named John Locke to develop a plan for the Carolinas. And he envisioned a feudal order where there would be serfs to run the economy. And that this was their goal, to create a system not dissimilar from the system that Spain had created in Mexico. And yet, for all these efforts, and despite these high-powered efforts of intellectuals to envision a feudal order in what would eventually become the United States, it proved impossible to create that. Not because they didn't want to, but because of other conditions that we've been talking about. Thank you.